Hello, everyone. Today we're going to discuss the causes of the Civil War. This is the Social Studies fourth grade standard, the fifth element in the history section. We're just going to briefly talk about each of these. So let's go to the first page. So one of the first causes of the Civil War was sectionalism. The North was divided into what we call the Union, and the South was divided into the Confederacy. You can see the representation of the different flags. So what is sectionalism? Well, it is the excessive devotion to local interests and customs to a region of a nation. The intense feelings of sectionalism further divided the country into two separate sections, North and South. Because the North and South had two different ways of because the North and the South had two different ways of living, they separated because, again, the definition, the excessive devotion to local interests. So the North was only concerned with, for the most part, the industry making. They were more industrious, more factories. They were really involved in that, and that's what they cared about and how that would profit their region. And the South was more into agriculture. Their land yielded more towards the agriculture. So they were more vested in that. So neither of them were really coming together to form one country, but almost section. You know, if you take a section of something, a part of something, that's what sectionalism is. The North was concerned about the North. They took their section and was devoted to that. The South took their section and was devoted to that. Prior to the Civil War, even before the Civil War, the United States was not really united. It was always divided. It was more like two separate countries, two separate economies, two separate opinions and views and differences on how the country should be ran. All these differences were very evident and very evident and very dividing just from the beginning. So the North, what was it about the North? What things did they focus on in sectionalism? Well, as I said previously, the North had an industry. They had large cities, and a diverse population, and they favored politics of the Republican Party, which supported the abolition of slavery. So that's many different things. So let's just stop and talk about each one. So industry, that is the factories. They made things, the production, things that were made. There were a lot of blacksmiths, people who made things. Factories, large factories. As you can see, the picture helps. Large cities, much more populated, much more dense in population. They favored politics of the Republican Party. Well, we know that the United States had the Republican and the Democratic Party. Well, the Republican Party supported the abolishing of slavery. So the North really supported the Republican Party because they wanted to abolish slavery. What about the Southern states? Well, they were loyal to their section. They initially even thought about themselves as their own citizens, even though they were a part of the United States. They already considered themselves a whole different citizenship, a whole different government. They considered themselves a separate entity of the United States than Southerners. So Southerners were second and U.S. citizens third. So as you can see, there was, we are our own state, like we are our own section. Then we're Southerners, then they're U.S. citizens. So they really did not associate themselves with being U.S. citizens. So what was the second cause? Well, slavery, and that was one of the biggest issues with slavery. It was, that sandpaper to smooth surface. It really escalated things. So the South viewed slavery as a necessity to maintain the economic wealth. As I said before, the South had an agricultural economy. And a lot of them had huge acres, and their economy relied on the production of what they grew. And they needed slaves to help maintain and help, pull out their profit and get, as much as they could out of the land they had. And it required slaves. It really did. They couldn't have done it without slaves. But the North felt like slavery was unconstitutional. Remember when we talked about the constitutional, all men are created right, all men are created equal. And everyone has and even the Declaration of Independence said that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, slavery violated those things, and the North was not too happy about the fact that this was taking place because it was unconstitutional. Well, then the question becomes, well, why didn't they care about the Constitution? Why didn't the South view slavery as unconstitutional? Well, if we go back and we remember, they considered themselves U.S. citizens third. They considered themselves U.S. citizens absolutely last, which means I'm my own citizen. So if I consider this last, I'm not going to really hold too much weight to the Constitution. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. So a lot of slaves were escaping to the North to become free. And once they, passed that, once they got to the North, they were considered free. Well, this created tensions between the North and the South, because the South felt like the North was letting their property and their means of profiting and having a good economy to escape. So they went to legislation, and eventually which is the head of the legislative branch, is the Congress. They went and eventually came out with the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and it just required that everyone in the United States had to, if they saw a runaway slave, they had to catch that slave. They couldn't help them escape, they had to catch it. And it is now a crime to help runaway slaves. So this made the Underground Railroad, that we talked about that before we left school, this made the Underground Railroad illegal. And even if the runaway slaves made it to the North, they were by law required to send them back or to capture them. And the people in the North were really angry about this. They did not agree with this whatsoever. So then we have another case called the Dred Scott case of 1857. This was 7 years after the Slave Fugitive Law. Scott was taken to the North by his owner to live for about 5 years. Then he was taken back to Missouri. When the owner died, Scott sued for his freedom in the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled the following. So Dred Scott was a free man. And, Dred Scott was, let me rephrase that, he was not free. He was a slave, and they moved to the North. When the owner died, Scott was to be set free. And he sued for his freedom. Well, the judge on that case, the justice on that case, the judge, ruled 4 things. One, that slaves are not citizens, so they cannot sue. Because slaves are considered property, something you own, they're not citizens, so they don't have the constitutional right to sue. Slaves, again, slaves are property. They can be taken anywhere. So just like you pick up your phone and you take it wherever you want, and when you lay it down, it's still yours, it's still your property. No matter where you go, your phone is still yours. It's your property. You own it. That's how they felt about slaves. And because the Fifth Amendment protected property, the Congress cannot ban slavery from any territory. So the Fifth Amendment, you can't ban. It protects your own personal property. Remember the illegal search and seizure. You can't just seize someone's property or take someone's property. So the Fifth Amendment really protected slave owners from their slaves being taken. And the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Third cause, states' rights. So the states' rights is the idea that each state had the right to determine whether or not to follow federal laws. So if the federal, which is the U.S. laws, it is the highest law in our country, the federal law, that is the United States government, not the individual states, these are the United States. Each state could decide, oh, I want to follow this, or I don't want to follow this. So that's like if our principles would be the federal law. And our principles would be the federal law. And each teacher could say, well, I don't want to follow that, so I'm just not going to follow it. I'm just going to do my own thing. Does that work? It doesn't. Each teacher is required to follow the law and the rules and regulations of the principal, which will be that federal law. Each teacher will be like a state. Each classroom will be a state. And I can't sit here and say, oh, I'm just not going to follow it. That just doesn't work. Doesn't work at all. Southerners supported states' rights. They wanted it. Why? It goes back to the beginning when we said they really did not consider themselves U.S. Citizens. That was the last thing on their mind. They considered themselves an individual entity, an individual part that just resided, that just so happened to be in the United States. They believed that they had the right to own slaves, to even succeed or separate. To succeed means to separate, to secede, sorry, not succeed. To secede means to separate or leave the Union if they desired. They felt like they could do whatever they wanted because, again, they felt they were separate. So these state rights really caused an issue because if we set federal laws, and you just decide that, oh, I can just ignore it, that's an issue. Northerners did not support states' rights. They believed that a national government had final power. So the North really felt like, of course, the federal government does not have laws on every single part of life, but the North did feel like whatever laws, even on the issue, whatever laws that were set in place, those Bill of Rights, those amendments, all those were the final power. If it violated those laws at any point, you couldn't do it. So they felt like the national government should have the final power. It should be, the place to look to for guidance. Again, the principals in the building are our federal government. We look to them, whatever guidelines they set in place, those are the guidelines we follow. We don't go off and do our own thing. So that is, an example of how the North would respond. We would just do what we're supposed to do. Tariffs. Okay, so it's a tax on imported goods. So Northerners felt that the federal government had the power to make laws that apply to all states, including imposing taxes. I'm pretty sure you could probably guess that the Southerners did not feel this way. It was a very important thing because if you don't have taxes on the whole state, that means that the federal government does not have enough money to fund an army, to do things that needed to build the country. So the North felt like it is important that the federal government make these laws that hold all the states to an accountability, including imposing taxes. The Southerners were angry that Congress were using its power to impose taxes on the South's agricultural products. Again, the South felt like it was its own little part, its own little section. So they felt, no, you don't have the right to tax something that I've grown, that I've worked for. And they felt like any federal tax or restricted the rights of individual states. Again, this goes back to, states' rights. I don't have to follow. I shouldn't have to follow what I don't want to. Texans were for low tariffs to continue to trade cotton with European nations, and Southern states produce 80% of the world's supply of cotton. So you have to understand that the South had a huge economical responsibility. 80% of the world's cotton, the whole world's cotton, came from the South. So this tax would, not only hurt them, but it would require a lot from them because they, produce 80% of the world's supply, and it would have given, a substantial amount of money to the U.S. government. The election of 1860, so this was kind of like the cherry on top, as you would say. Remember, the North supported the Republican Party because the Republicans were abolitionists. They were against slavery. Well, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860. And this really angered Southerns because they felt like, oh my goodness, we have a Republican in office who is an abolitionist. This means that our rights will no longer be respected. Like, what we feel will no longer be respected because someone who does not share our views is in power. And many Southerners, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, a lot of Southerners decided, you know what, it's time to secede. It's time to leave the Union. It's pretty much, essentially, it's time to leave the United States. We don't want to be a part of this anymore. So after his election, seven Southern states eventually seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate State of America. So it wasn't even that little section, those 7 states, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. All of those countries were no longer considered the United States of America. They no longer wanted to be considered the United States of America. They were considered the Confederate States of America. Texas lawmakers voted to secede by a vote of 1688. The people of, so pretty much a lot of people. That last section just tells us a lot of people were, a lot of people in the South, those 7 states, they were definitely for separating. As you can see, the red are the Union states, and it's a lot of the Union states. The color that's in like that blue greenish color, these were states that had slavery and they were considered slave states. However, they did not secede. They didn't agree with seceding or separating themselves from the Union, from pretty much the United States. And the area in the gray we'll talk about once we actually get into the war, but there was a Fort Sumter, there was a battle called Fort Sumter, and after the fall of Fort Sumter, these 4 states, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, all of them, joined later on, joined the Confederate States of America. So again, let's go back and let's review. Sectionalism. What was sectionalism? Sectionalism was the idea that my area, my section, my region, I'm just devoted to this region. and what it has to offer, and I'm going to be devoted to it, and this is what's important to me. Not necessarily the good of all, but just my section. So the North were into their section and their way of life and their economy, and the South was into their section, their piece of land, and their economy and their way of life. Slavery. The South wanted to keep slaves, were pro-slavery, and the North were anti-slavery. The North felt like the slavery was unconstitutional. It violated the rights of just being human, especially being a human in the United States of America. States' rights. The Southerners felt like states should have the choice whether or not to follow federal law. The Northern states felt, no, that's not how it goes. The federal government, which is the highest government in a country, should have the final say in the most important laws. Therese, taxes. They felt like, the Southern states felt like the federal government has no business taxing me on my economy, on how I make my money. But the Northern states felt like, no, that's a good idea. The government, the federal government should tax all states on, on production, to help boost the economy. The election of 1860 in secession. So the fact that President Abraham Lincoln was a Republican that was voted into office in 1860 was a huge issue, because the South were like, we do not want a Republican who is against slavery as president. And that was their final straw. They have had enough. So they seceded and separated from the United States, essentially telling them, listen, I'm out. They left. They simply ran away. Like, I don't want to be a part of this house anymore. I'm done. I'm over it. So that's really the end of it. That was the last straw. And next time we talk about this, we will be talking about, just the different battles and events that happened in the Civil War.